dear President, Vice Presidents, our deans, professors, teachers, and students. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all at the Teachers Research IATEFL ReSIG 2018 International Conference. For today, I will be your presenter. I'm the senior student of English language teaching and as coach. You know, we're all aficionados and contributors to the field, and rather than me only greeting you, we can start it by greeting each other. Let's have a sociable welcome. On my count of three, please turn to your neighbor and say hello. On my count of three. There are no strangers, only another one you're yet to meet. I'm counting. 1, 2, 3. Okay. We can start it by greeting each other. Let's have a sociable welcome. On my count of three, please turn to your neighbor and say hello. Okay. We're delighted to have you all distinguished guests in the third event, again at Bahçeşehir University, Turkey. We have a variety of topics and fascinating plenary speakers who will be highlighting recent developments in teacher research with a focus on different aspects of research engagement. By the way, you can tweet using our hashtag resigistanbul. So, to begin with, I would like to invite Organizing Committee Chair Elif Canan Onat to the stage to give her welcoming remarks.
Hi. My dear Rector, School of Foreign Languages Director, my dearest colleagues, and my friends, good morning. Can you hear my voice? Okay, good. I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to this conference that we have the privilege of hosting in our South Campus in a third time in a row. The difference between this year's event and the previous ones is that this year additionally focuses on personal research experiences on EAP and ESP instructors who teach university students. This year there will be total of 84 presentations, actually 119 abstracts submitted. We have 30 academicians, 55 teachers, 3 research assistants, a postdoctoral researcher, a teaching fellow, and most importantly, 46 prospective teachers with their mentors from different national and international educational institutions to present their research results. Yes. During the conference, 18 students from our departments of our university, such as advertising, economics, English teaching, law, genetics, psychological counseling and guidance, and software engineering, who graduated from prep school, our prep school, successfully, and speak English very well, and successfully completed our courses, academic English courses, as freshmen. So they will be in charge of helping you with their members, with the members of organizing committee, who are the instructors of Modern Languages Department. Since I set up this department, Modern Languages Department, in 2008, my team has always known that organizing an international conference was my pillar. I've always told them that organizing an international conference would be my gift to them, that I'm happy for. Before I finish my words, I wish to thank warmly to everyone in our university who support and works for this event. I would also like to thank our main sponsor, Garnet, Ola Twist, and Necip İnselel, and other sponsors for their support. Before closing, I have to extend further thanks to IATEFL Head Office and Special Interest Group for their cooperation. Let me now close by wishing you a delightful and stimulating 2 days. Thank you.
Now it is time for our opening speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to invite our rector, Professor Dr. Şenay Yalçın, to the stage to give his opening speech.
Dear colleagues and distinguished participants, with your polite permissions, I have to make an explanation before start to my speech. We are very busy due to the graduation ceremony that will take place tomorrow at our university. So, I have to leave at the end of my talk. I hope you will understand me. You are all invited to this graduation ceremony. As a teacher for 44 years, I would like to welcome you to the annual conference of International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language Research Special Interest Group, 2018. I have been told that there are academics, teachers, pre-service teachers, mentors, and their students from different schools and universities all over Turkey and the world, who come all the way to contribute to the conference with their participation. Such variety surely will make this conference an unforgettable experience for everybody here and contribute greatly to the understanding of learning and teaching languages. Dear friends, teacher education has become a priority in Turkey, mostly because the major changes in the role our country is playing in the Middle East and in the region in which our country is located. Being a member of Global Educational Foundation, BAU is very much aware of its role in the education of language teachers in order to build a better future. This conference is a means to achieving this goal. By initiating such international conferences, BAU aims to promote the concept of teachers as researchers in terms of generating knowledge that would inform their practices. I am sure this conference will also contribute to the theoretical knowledge in its field. Indeed, being a teacher is one of the most challenging professions, mostly because of teachers' responsibility for the intellectual development of humanity. This is a role that keeps all nations peace in the world. I hope you exchange ideas and enjoy your time at our university. To meet here again next year, I wish you all a rewarding and successful conference.
Dear guests, you know, we have plenary speakers, concurrent workshops, and presentations, but what about the concept of the conference and more? What is up with the ReSIG network and publications? For this, I would like to invite Kenan Dikilitaş and Mark White to the stage to enlighten us further.
Hello, yes, good morning. It's wonderful to be back here at this conference again. I can see a lot of faces that have people who have been here in past years, and it's really good to see everyone again, and also new faces who are going to discover how enriching, empowering, how wonderful this conference can be, I trust. Yes. So we'd just like to start by just saying a little bit, providing a little bit of context about the IATEFL ReSIG and no, not yet. No, sorry, back. No, sorry, just a little bit of information about the research SIG. You've already had an activity just speaking to your neighbor. What does the A stand for in IATEFL? Could you just please tell the person sitting next to you? And the I in SIG, what does it stand for? Please just again tell the person sitting next to you. And how old is IATEFL? Yes, another question. Tell the person sitting next to you. How old? Okay, let's see. Okay, so answers, please. So the A stands for association, yes. So the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. The I stands for interest, yes. Special interest group, exactly. And how old is IATEFL? 49, 50, it's close, yes, 50, 51, anyone? I think it's 51, 52, something like that, okay. Very close, excellent, okay, good. And if you're interested in finding out more about the history of IATEFL, Richard Smith, who sadly isn't here this year, he's been at every conference for the last few years, and he is here in spirit, has written a wonderful book about the history of IATEFL, which is available online if you wish to have a look at it. As IATEFL has developed, special interest groups have developed with it, including ESP, and we have the coordinator of the ESP SIG here as one of our plenary speakers, Aishan. So thank you, welcome. And we also have the research special interest group, and Kenan has recently been elected as co-coordinator of this, so congratulations to Kenan. If you go to our website, we actually have a lot of information available freely for teacher researchers, so please do visit it. On the welcome page, it provides some information about the kinds of activities that we do. So these include, for example, online discussions, webinars, conferences, we publish a newsletter, and we publish a book. What else do we do? I think that covers quite a bit. Okay.
Yeah, we do a lot of things, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So there's plenty of what we do, and we're going to just briefly run through a few of those things now.
Okay.
So, for example, we run online discussions. This was the most recent one. They are free for people to participate in. You just need to join our Yahoo group. The most recent discussion was about exploratory practice in EAP. We do have several online discussions each year. And until recently, I've been coordinating them, but the job of moderating them in the future has now passed to Chris, who's over here. So welcome, Chris. We bring in a variety of hosting moderators each time. We're also active in various countries. So, for example, Chile. Who's been to Chile? Could you put up your hand if you've been to Chile? No, not a lot of hands have gone up. But there are conferences there that are actually quite similar to this. Perhaps this is somewhere you could take your research in future. I think this year is the third conference in Latin America, which has actually been inspired by this conference and the success we've had with this conference. And also, of course, we're active in Turkey. Yeah. Would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, actually, thank you very much, Mark. As a country, Turkey is in education developing its practices, especially in language teacher education. And as research SIG, we are trying to contribute to this development with this event, with the publications, and with the online events actually. So the major purpose of this conference is disseminate knowledge that is created by teachers actually in their classrooms and sharing it at a wider community here with you in a very, let's say, interactive format. And the other purpose is like creating knowledge and generating knowledge for teachers, for teacher educators, and bring all of these together here. So this is also going to contribute to the, let's say, capacity building of Turkish language teachers of English in Turkey in this way. So we are more interested in developing this community here. Apart from this, actually, Chris is going to moderate, let's say, an online discussion within Yahoo group right after the conference. You can find details here in this, at the last page of the booklet. And the idea here is bringing you together after the conference and discuss what has been happening in this conference and how have we developed as a teacher. What are your impressions of development yourself, of yourself and of others, okay? Yeah?
Yeah. Okay, so Chris actually features quite heavily in this, this presentation because we also, as I said, we have a newsletter. We invite people to contribute to the newsletter. A number of articles are freely available online, including a report on last year's conference, which came out in the most recent issue. When I was on stage last year, I did say as well that please do contribute. We did have someone from Turkey, from the conference here, Cemile, who contributed a couple of poems. I did invite creative contributions as well as impressions of the conference. If you'd like to contribute to our newsletter, please do. Again, the information is available on the website. We also publish books. This is an example of one of the books that we've published, again, freely available to teachers and teacher researchers. This actually came out of a conference in Harrogate in the UK a few years ago. It provides actually lots of interesting examples of ways of presenting posters and doing so in a visually attractive way, people reporting on their research in that way.
And as you might see, we have also produced another book this year. It's a good example of sustainability in teacher learning, let's say. And this book is characterized by its diversity because it brings together pre-service teachers, in-service teachers, and actually teacher educators across the world who are providing constructive feedback on the submitted articles, let's say. And to show the sustainability issue, actually, I would like to show this one with 4 books together. They are creating knowledge, as I said, and especially creating diversity in collaboration among teachers from different institutions. And next time, I think we would like to see more teachers collaborating with other teachers in different institutions rather than working alone in their classrooms to create research. What do you think about that?
Definitely.
That's a good suggestion that people can understand each other, their students, their colleagues in different contexts, learning more about different practices, classroom practices, to develop their own practices in their own classrooms.
And there will be a book that comes out of this conference as well, so bear that in mind. We will be making guidelines available.
Yeah, and last one, I think, we need to, in next year's IATEFL conference will be held in Liverpool, and you'll be more than welcome if you can attend our pre-service conference event, where the plenaries will include Richard Smith and Burns. They're going to talk about very interesting topics, right? And thank you very much. We're happy to see you. Thank you.
Now, the first plenary speaker of our conference. I'm very proud to invite Gary Barcusen to the stage to give his plenary speech.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here again. I was here last year. It's my second year at this conference. It's one of the more stimulating events that I go to each year. It's wonderful to engage with so many teachers and researchers and students, and also to engage with wonderful conference organizers. This is an exceptionally well-organized conference, and I want to thank Elif and the organizing committee not only for putting on such a brilliant conference, but also for inviting me back this time to talk to you. I'm going to be talking in this the next 30 minutes about stories and how we can use stories as part of our research. I want to start by getting you just to think about all the stories that you hear and all the stories that you tell in your lives as teachers. We are completely surrounded by stories in all the work we do. If you think of when you talk to other teachers about a student that's really good or a student that's giving you trouble, or about another teacher that you may gossip about, a lot of these bits of information we share are in the form of stories. We tell stories about what we do in the classroom, what we do in schools. We tell stories even on a wider scale, on a national scale, stories to do with education, with ministries of education, with huge curriculum developments and assessment requirements. These are big, big stories. So what I want to do today is just to get you, while I'm talking, to think about all the different stories that you construct and that you encounter in your lives as teachers and teacher educators. In the workshop I'm doing tomorrow, I'll be going into a little more detail about one type of analysis for working with stories. What do we do when we collect stories? And I'll be talking about a type of analysis called short story analysis. But for now, I want to give you more or less an overview of narrative inquiry, or how we can make use of stories in our research. And I'll also share with you a very small action research project that I did with a graduate class at my university in New Zealand. The first question to ask, I guess, is what is a story? What are stories? Now, there are many different definitions of story, both different academic definitions and also cultural definitions in different cultures, in different societies around the world. What we mean by story is very, very different. And it's the same in narrative inquiry or in looking at working with stories in research. So I like to try and break it down to some of the essentials. And I think this is a fairly common definition of story. When I'm working with stories in my research, it helps me just to make sense of what I'm doing. So if I think of stories, firstly, they narrate experience, either experience that we've lived in the past or experiences that we imagine in the future. So it's about personal experience. If you tell someone a story, you're telling them something about what happened to you, or that you've observed, or that you've seen happen with someone else. It's about our experiences, right? And you can immediately see how stories can be quite useful for research purposes if they focus on experience, either lived or experiences that we imagine in the future. Stories also include reflective or evaluative commentary. So it's not simply, I woke up, I had breakfast, I caught the bus, I went to work. That's just a series of events, right? But with stories, the narrator is expressing some sort of evaluation of those events. So I woke up and I wasn't in the mood for work today. I was exhausted. Then I got up, I had breakfast, and it was a horrible old breakfast, the same I have every day. Then I climbed on the bus, and the bus was delayed, and we got stuck in traffic. So it's more than just what happened. It's your evaluation or your reflections on what happened. And those are really, really useful for research purposes when we find out not just the events or the facts that we can get from a questionnaire, right? But it's also about our reflections on those events. They typically have a time or a temporal dimension. So the story is related to things happening over time. You know, like in literature, we talk about the plot, the different action. That next point, they show evidence of narrative action. So something happens in the story. There's some action that unfolds over time. It's typical of stories as well. And they just look like stories. We all know what a story is, right? So when we start to break it down, what is a story, sometimes it gets a little bit complex, and we think, well, we know what a story is, right? From when we grew up, we listened to stories, we were told stories, we told stories ourselves. We just sort of know, we get a feel for what a story is. So that last point is a very loose definition of a story. But some of those other aspects, I think, are quite important for identifying a story in the research we do. This is one of my favorite definitions, not so much about what story is, but what stories do, by Cramp. And she says, stories assist humans to make life experiences meaningful. So through the telling of a story, we make meaning of the experiences that we are telling about. So through the telling of the story, we put the parts together in a way that makes sense for us so that we're able to interpret and get meaning from the stories that we are telling. So immediately I'm thinking, wow, that would be useful for research purposes, because then we're finding out how the person telling the story understands the particular experiences that they are telling about. So they assist humans to make life experiences meaningful. This is my favorite. Stories preserve our memories. And that happens not only individually, but from, within different cultures, from generation to generation. The stories preserve our memories. We preserve our interpretation of the events in a story form, right? They prompt our reflections. That's not just this happened, this fact, that fact, but reflecting on those facts as well. They connect us with our past and with our present, which gives a coherence to our lives over time. But they also assist us to envision our future. So when working with stories in action research or other types of teacher research, for example, it's not simply telling the story to understand what we've done, but it also helps us to think about the future. Think about our future practice and the way we work in the future. And I'm going to end with that point in about 23 minutes. Just remember that point. I just want to just summarize very briefly what I've said in terms of research, right? So there we've got on the top left something that happened in our life, the experience. So it's a life event, some experience, or what Anita Pavlenko calls life reality. That's reality. That's what actually happened, right? What happened. So if I'm walking across the stage and I'm sort of like that, that's actually what happened, right? That's a life event. Now, that in research is very hard to make to recapture later on. What happens in the classroom has happened in the classroom. It's very hard to recapture. But what we try to do is how we make meaning of those life events. So I was walking across the stage and I tripped. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Here I am in a conference and I fell across the stage. You know, it's how you understand those life events, how they are experienced, what Pavlenko calls subject reality. It's the reality understood from the subject's position, subject reality. And then, of course, we also can describe those experiences. This is the narrative. So what Pavlenko calls text reality. So this is what is said or written. So if you're interviewing a teacher about the lesson that they've just had in the classroom, the teacher can only tell you about that, their experience of what happened. They're never going to capture exactly what happened in any type of research, right? That's past. But what we are aiming for in narrative and all types of qualitative research, in all types of research probably, is the meaning making that the participants experience. Their understanding, their interpretation of those events in the top left corner, right? So through the narration, through the telling of stories, the listening to stories, constructing stories, what we're aiming to do is to find out about how people experience their lived realities. Not the lived realities themselves, because that's gone. It's far too complex for us to capture. Even if you use video cameras, even if you use statistics, it's still not going to capture that reality. When I think of narrative research and working with stories, I try to break it down to a number of dimensions. 4 I've come up with at the moment that I'm working on. 4 dimensions that tend to summarize altogether narrative or story research. And the first one, I hope you can read that, is a dimension, it's a continuum, right? So we've got on the one extreme, we've got narrative study, and that's where narrative is the object of study. So this is the work of linguists, right? Or some sociolinguists are interested in how narratives are actually constructed. Also, those involved in literary theory. You know, what is a narrative? But with narrative inquiry on this end of the the continuum, here we are more interested in how we can use narrative as a means to study something, to understand something. So using stories to understand student motivation, or teacher identity, or classroom interaction. So using stories as a means to understand a particular phenomenon. So with action research, the type of research that we're interested in with teachers is that we're more towards that end of the continuum. We're less interested in what narratives look like. We're more interested in what narratives can tell us about what we are studying. The second dimension has to do with researcher engagement. How engaged is the researcher in the action that is being investigated? So with objective types of research, very quantitative objective research, the researcher wants to be disengaged from the action as much as possible. But when we're working with stories and we're working with teacher research, action research, you are very much in the midst of the action. You are part of the action, exploratory practice, action research. You are part of that action. And so we're very much concerned with that end of the continuum, right? Where teacher engagement is essential. The third one, and there's one more after this, so we'll look at 4. The third one has to do with whether the data we collect is non-story data. So, you know, you can get a teacher journal that writes their reflections, where teachers reflecting on, you know, that class and reflecting. That's not necessarily in a story form. It's just qualitative data, right? It's just, you know, regular teacher reflection. Extremely valuable, of course. But as you move towards this side of the dimension, you get the data in story form. So this is where the data that is worked with in the research is in a story form. When you go back to that second slide where I showed you what is a story, that is, the data looks something like that. It's got action, it's got experience, things unfold over time, and so on. So again, we're more interested in narrative inquiry, using stories in research on that end of the continuum, where the data we're working is in story form in some way. And then finally, what do we do with the data that we collect, whether it's teacher journals or it's interviews, or whether it's classroom observations and field notes of your own classroom or another classroom? What do we do with data? So on the left-hand side of the continuum, remember it's a continuum, so it's not only this or only that, but you move somewhere along that continuum. On that side, we've got where you do a thematic analysis or a content analysis. So you've got your data, and you look for themes, right? And then you combine the themes into categories. So it's sort of pulling the data apart a little bit, so that you come up with a set of themes from qualitative research. It's a very common method of analysis, right? As you move, which is fine, that's absolutely fine. You can work with narrative data in that way as well, absolutely fine. As you move towards this end of the continuum, here, what the researcher does is construct stories from the data that has been collected. So you may do a series of interviews, for example, or you may do a series of classroom observations with your field notes. And what the researcher does here is write a story. So put that data together into a story form. So Both of these are very common in action research, where on that side, you're doing a thematic analysis of story data or even non-story data, and on this end of the continuum, it's putting stories together. That's not easy to do, because usually when you put your data together into a story, it's not just summarizing what's happened, but it's putting the story together in relation to your research problem, to the topic of research. So you've got to focus the construction of that story onto what the phenomenon is that you are investigating. But both of those types of research, or of analysis rather, are very common in action research and teacher research as well. So I want to tell you just very briefly about a narrative action research project in order just to illustrate some of the ideas that I've been telling you about so far. This was with one of my postgraduate, one of my graduate courses that I teach at the University of Auckland. I don't teach it at the moment, but I did for a number of years, 10, 12 years, I think, if not more, on sociolinguistics and language teaching. And it was about looking at the social context of language teaching and language learning for teachers, either pre-service, but mainly in-service teachers as well. The course was over a 14-week semester, and it covered a number of topics which varied more or less from year to year, but there was something like this. Looked at sociolinguistic concepts related to language teaching, language and identity. We looked at ethnicity, gender, immigration, classroom interaction, language policy and practice, and research methodology, and so on. So a whole bunch of social context, sociolinguistic type topics that were relevant to language teaching and language learning. As part of this project, the participants included 32 teachers. These were 32 people in the classroom, 32 students in the classroom, some of whom were pre-service teachers and others with many years of teaching experience. So there was a very wide range of experience. And they came from a number of different countries, a big international student body. So you can see all the different countries there. And there were a couple of New Zealanders in the class as well. And of course, I was a participant in the action research as the lecturer on the course. Okay. So what the students did in this course was they wrote 4 personal narratives, or 4 stories about anything to do with language teaching and language learning in relation to what we were doing in the course. So there was some guidance in the form of what they should be writing about, and that was the content of the course. But I wanted them to tell their personal stories of their experiences of language learning and of language teaching. This was then going to be analyzed by them, doing a content analysis for their final assignment. So of course they had to write them, right? Because they were going to do assignment on them. So they had to write these 4 narratives. There was a little bit of, resentment there, but that was part of their assignment. They had to do these 4 narratives, and I'd been doing this for a number of years in my classes. The same class, they would write their 4 narratives, and they would do a content analysis, and I would grade the papers, and then the next year, they would be the same. And I thought, I wonder if this is effective. I wonder if the students actually enjoy doing this. If it's an assignment that is worth something for them and also for me. So I decided to investigate that question. And I designed a pre- and post-perceptions survey of their narrative inquiry experience. And I'll show that to you in a few minutes. I just want to talk a little bit more about what I was expecting to find in the narratives. So this is a diagram that I think last year I may have presented it, and I'm going to talk about it much more in the workshop tomorrow. But these were three dimensions that are very typical of story. Where the story takes place, who is in the story, and when the action takes place. So I wanted the teachers, in writing their reflections, their narratives, to think about these 3 questions. Who is in the story? Where does the action take place? And when does it take place? This is in order to give them some sort of structure to their writing of the narrative. And most important, I wanted them to think about these questions when they came to analyze their narratives that they wrote for their assignment. Related to that, and I'll go into this in much more detail tomorrow as well, is what I called 3 different levels of story. So I'll just simplify it really for now, and that first level, the story with small letters, is what happens in the classroom with the teacher and his or her students in the classroom, the small stories. But then we move out in terms of the context. The context moves out, and we've got story with a capital S. So what happens in institutions, in a school or university, teacher education program? So it's moving out from just the teacher and his or her learners, but moving out a little bit more to look at the institutional stories that the teacher is a part of, all right, or the researcher is a part of. It's moving out, and then you get stories with capital letters. And over here, these are the macro stories that are part of our lives. So things that happen at a national level or even a global level in education. Think of different, curriculum designs or teaching methods or different policies that are often imposed on us by higher authorities. These are these big stories that affect what we do in the classroom, right? They all interrelate. And so what I wanted the teachers to do was not only when constructing, but also in analyzing their stories, to think not only about me and my learners, but to think about the bigger picture, the bigger story as well. So if you put those two together, the 3 dimensions and the stories, it creates a sort of story space, a narrative space, a context in which the participants, or the narrator, live their lives, right, within this 3-dimensional space. Okay, so I designed this survey now to find out how well this had all worked. There were 10 questions. I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 of them today because it will take too long. I want just to give you the idea of what I did. So there was a pre-survey. So if you look at question 1, pre, I asked that question at the beginning of the semester, and then after the 14 weeks, I asked the same question, but in the past tense. So to them to think about it now 14 weeks later. So the first one says, how much do you think you are going to enjoy writing the narratives? All right, this is at the beginning. And 5 is more positive. 1 is less positive. So you can see 76% were on the sort of positive side. So it was quite high. I mean, I think they could see that this was not going to be too much of an effort. And then at the end, how much did you enjoy writing? It actually went up from 76 to 90. So the percentage went up, which is an indication that their perception of how they would enjoy it was lower than how they actually did enjoy it. So that was nice for me to know, as the teacher on the course, that the teachers in the class were actually enjoying doing this. It's not 100% right, never is, but it's still quite positive. So these are some of the comments from the post questionnaire, the one at the end, some comments. They also wrote comments at the beginning, but I won't go into those. So the first one here said, it's interesting to reflect on our own teaching, to rethink teaching. That was quite nice, to rethink teaching. So the stories that they wrote over the semester got them to rethink teaching. I like that. Another comment was, enjoyed tapping into my subconscious and retrieving things that I had thought trivia, just little things, but realizing that I had not fully forgotten about them because of their importance. So the story, remember that quote by Cramp said, it preserves our memories. So this story enabled the memory to come back up again through the reflective story writing. So that was a nice sort of positive outcome. The second question looked at the opposite. How anxious do you feel now before starting to write? This was the beginning of the semester. And there was quite a bit of anxiety. You see the numbers on the left-hand side. It's quite low, 61%. But by the end of it, it had jumped up to 85. So some said, oh, it's just quite easy to write. It gets easier. The more you do it, the easier it gets. I like this comment. The focus in the last narrative was on something very emotional. So writing these stories often brings up things that are quite emotional for teachers, that they realize things that they may not have really thought deeply enough about. But the stories bring out the emotional aspects of their experiences. And one says, it's not at all anxious because it's my own story. And I like that. Writing the stories, it's not right or wrong, but it's my story. You know, you can't argue with that. This is me interpreting my own experiences. And so it's you know, what must I be anxious about, right? Here's a third one. How much do you think writing narratives will result in you reflecting on your own experiences and observations of language teaching? So how much do you think it's going to get you to reflect on your experiences? And it was quite high, and it stayed high at the end, from 84 to 90. And one said, I became aware of how we are influenced by the outside world. So interesting. Tend to be a little insulated and think about yourself in your classroom. But when you start to tell stories about what happens, you realize that there's a lot of influence from outside, things from outside that are affecting the way you and your school operates. If you don't write it down, there's not much reflection going on. Quite like that. Interesting advice. Reflection encourages critical thinking about new ideas, and it's better to understand oneself as a language teacher. So these are a whole bunch of positive things that come out through reflecting on one's own experiences. And number 8, the second to last one, do you think narrative writing is going to change the way you think about language teaching? This is at the beginning. Change the way you think about language teaching, and then later on it said, did narrative writing actually change the way you think about language teaching? And look, that's quite a big jump from 68 to 82%. So the teachers obviously found the story writing experience really, really useful in terms of thinking about what they do. One of the comments, I have a new perspective to view what I took for granted before. It gives me a chance to improve, to address my issues, to put me in a stronger position. And this is one of my favorites. Listen to this one. I don't think it really changed the way I think. It made me think about the way I think. So through writing the stories, it's not just, oh, I thought differently, but I thought about the way I thought differently. And that's very effective. I rather like that. And here's the last one, just of the 5. As I said, there were 10, but I'll just look at 5. This was the very last one, and this was a more general question. So do you think language teachers would benefit from the practice of narrative writing, of story writing? And they, before the semester, thought quite positively, yes, 81%. And then at the end, they still thought, with a little bit of an increase, that writing about our stories of experience will benefit from the practice. It will benefit language teachers. And some of the comments, to discover problems in the practice, yes. Begin to see language teaching from a broader perspective. That's the repetition of that earlier one. It's looking outside of just what we do, the broader macro perspectives. And reflection leads to awareness of one's own effectiveness. And then this was a really nice response, which I quite liked. I will go on writing. So, yay, that's really good. It's not just you've done it for the class, but you will continue to write stories about your experience. One teacher summed this up, and she was talking specifically here about not so much writing the stories, but analyzing the stories for the assignment. And she makes the point that analyzing the narratives provided me with an opportunity to critically reflect on what happened in the classroom. And that made me think deeply about what is good learning. So not just writing stories reflectively, but actually interpreting those stories as well. It's like an extra step in the process. So it's interpreting the stories. It makes you be even more critical in terms of your reflection of what those experiences were. I rather like that. However, there were some comments that showed that there was room for improvement from my perspective as a lecturer running this course. There were 3 or 4 things that were salient, that came up a lot in the comments. The one was about the topic. This teacher said, at times it was frustrating when I was not sure what to write about. You know, I can understand that. You say, write 4 narratives, off you go. what do I write about? How much do I reveal about myself? What stories do I tell? Do I bring my families into it, or my boyfriend, or my girl? No, maybe not. What do I write about? So what I did to improve that was to give early on much more guidance about the writing process, things to consider when starting to write. We looked at ways of generating potential topics to do with language teaching and learning, and even suggested some topics. So for your next narrative, perhaps you want to write about your language learning experience in relation to what we've just done this week in the classroom. So to try and give and so I started to do that. A second room for improvement was the assignment. The thought of doing the analysis caused some anxiety. So students, the teachers were quite worried about having to do the assignment. Yes, I'm writing stories, reflecting on my experience, but there's assignment at the end of it, right? So that was in the back of their mind all the time. So what I did there was to provide some very specific instructions early on about the assignment, how to go about doing the assignment, and what criteria would be used to evaluate the assignment, and to try and reassure them that that the process was not going to result in any harsh penalties for the way they had reflected. The third one had to do with the writing. I didn't write it well, said one teacher. My grammar's all messed up. And a lot of people were concerned. I'm writing, this is an academic exercise. I'm concerned about my writing. What I did here was to reassure them that the writing was not evaluated. It was what they were writing about that was of interest, right? So I never evaluated the writing. And for each of the narratives, I would write some feedback. And after a week or so, they saw I'm not concerned about the writing. I never corrected anything. And so I reassure them, we're not evaluating the writing. Just do your free writing. Just write your stories, And that seemed to help them. And just one more here. In terms of the scope, one teacher said that the 4 narratives are limited. It's only part of my teaching life. So I invited them to write at least those 4, which they needed for the assignment, but they were welcome to write as much as they wanted to. So they could send me more stuff to have a look at rather than just the 4 required. Okay, just to end off then, my reflections on that action research project and also what I've been saying about story. Firstly, it was clear that the teachers' investment was quite high. They invested in the process. Not only, I think, because of the assignment that they had to do, but also because I think they did see it was worthwhile. And as you saw, some of them quite enjoyed doing it, even though ultimately there was an assignment involved. There were benefits that were evident, and you saw the questionnaire results, and I just showed you 5. There were 10 questions. They all showed improvement. So from my perspective, I could see that there were benefits for the teachers writing the stories. And in all my courses I teach, I still have some sort of narrative reflective writing. It's not necessarily in the form I've just told you now, but I always include some story sharing, whether they're multimodal stories on YouTube, or whether it's a teacher journal, or whether they're letters, or whatever the case may be. And as I said right at the beginning, we are embedded in stories. They're there, they're around us. We tell them, we hear them. And number 5, not only our own stories, but the stories of others. And it seems like if these stories are there, and we're creating them, constructing them, and hearing them, why not use them for research, for teacher research? You can include them in exploratory practice, include them in action research. It's just focusing on the story where people make sense of their lives. So use them, and we can construct new ones as well. So not just thinking about the past, but looking ahead. And ultimately then, to live new stories. So in our work, once we understand what we do, we're able to live new experiences and live new stories. Okay, thank you very much. Nice picture of New Zealand.